So welcome, Jim, and thank you very much. And we look forward to what you have to say to us.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. Good evening, everyone. I'll say good afternoon, really, but it's it's not dark outside. I just wanted to give a little warning at the start that I will be speaking, as I talk about the nature of police chaplaincy, I will be mentioning some incidents along the way, and I'll understand if when I mention those, it's something that you've actually been around or been involved in, and you'd rather that I didn't speak further about that. I'm going to be very careful anyway, but if you just sort of want to give a little wave and say, I was there, I will understand. But I just thought I should let you know about that in advance. I'm sorry about the reflection in my glasses. Jeffrey and I have been trying to work out how to do something about that, and we've given up, apart from taking my specs off. Just by way of my personal background, very briefly, I've been an Anglican priest for almost 53 years. Prior to ordination, I was a PMG technician. Not everybody knows what PMG stands for anymore these days, but the Postmaster General's Department. And my work was mainly involved in telephone exchange installation, which was an interesting field. If you do some very quick maths, yes, I started work at the age of 15. My father was a First World War veteran and was wounded in the Battle of Polygon Wood in Belgium, and was shipped back here, and then went through the Great Depression. So by the time I appeared, and he was getting on in years when my mother had me, he just said, you know, you've had enough of this schooling business, son, you need to get out and get a job. And it was all about permanency and get a government job at that. So that was that. So I caught up on my schooling and my education at some later date after I was married, I have to say. But I did do a 5-year apprenticeship and worked until I was nearly 30 with the Postmaster General's Department. I've been married to Rosemary for 63 years. We have 2 adult daughters and 4 grandchildren. And it's been, I have to say, very much a team effort all the way along, as I'm sure you appreciate with your various fields of endeavour. The title chaplain is really dates back to the very early centuries of the church. It's thought of around about the 3rd or 4th century. And the association, obviously, in one sense, being with chapels, but it also coming from the Latin capella, the cloak of St. Martin, which people in sort of chaplaincy roles then retained as a symbol of their ministry, and then that's translated and transformed itself into the word chaplain today. So these days, chaplains are appointed to schools and to prisons and to hospitals and to embassies and to universities, and notably to the armed forces, where there's a very long tradition of chaplaincy, the chaplain being the one who is present with them in the battle. And there's a good symbolic aspect to that, I think, as apart from the role that the chaplain played of, in the Christian sense, celebrating communion services in the field and providing pastoral care and moral support wherever they were fighting or based. So this presentation is not really so much a quick statement of what the role is, but how I came to discover what I think the role is. And it has many facets to it. And I'd just like to share some of that gradual understanding with you tonight, because there was a huge learning curve on my part when I went into a policing organisation, as distinct from being in the parish setting, which I had worked in before. And it was learning curve, learning curve, learning curve. And then I think I would have to say you never stop learning. That's true of all of our professions and interests, I guess, but you really have to realise that there's always something in the field of policing to learn. And I'll talk a little bit about the complications of that in a moment. So I had, apart from my time as full-time senior chaplain, I had roughly 8 years part-time after I retired. Not sure what retired means yet, but anyway, I worked with the homicide squad and the major collision investigation unit in supporting them, because they were areas that really interested me, and where I was happy to do that at a slower pace and a less pressured way than when I was senior chaplain. So these days, chaplains can be Christian, Muslim, Jewish, etc., Sikh, and I'll talk a little bit more about that down the track. That's been an interesting thing for police chaplains this year, as Easter, Passover, Ramadan and Greek Orthodox Easter were all pretty close together. And as I say, I'll speak about that in a moment. I'll be primarily reflecting or referring to police chaplaincy as my point of reference for the issues I want to talk about. But of course, they apply, I think, equally to all emergency services workers. And we might just think very briefly about the breadth of what we call emergency services workers, because we have obviously our ambulance paramedics. There are St John volunteers too, who get caught up in interesting and challenging situations, confronting situations at times, at some of the venues that they attend at. And I say that, by that I mean, you know, the death of a person, a heart attack at a football match, for example, where St John serves those scenes, those venues. St John also provides the coronial services support for the coroner. There's a team of over 30 people at St John who work 24/7 in doing the coroner's transfers, as they call them, and they attend the murders, the road trauma, the deaths in a public place where it becomes a coroner's responsibility, etc., etc. So they see some very confronting things, and one of my roles as chaplain to St John now is to look after that particular team. Fire Rescue Victoria, the combination now of the CFA and the MFB, they attend road incidents, as you know, and many other scenes where they also are confronted with death and injury. The State Emergency Service do a fantastic job, and Marine Search and Rescue, which is one that not a lot of people think about, but they go into some pretty dangerous situations when boats are in trouble and in other situations on the water. And then Life-Saving Victoria is one that I would include in that, because if you're doing your life-saving along the ocean coast in Victoria, and then you're suddenly dealing with trying to revive somebody, or you know, you're actually dealing with death and seeing that, they can be confronting issues too. So they're what I would call the first responders, but a chaplain to Victoria Police is not just ministering to first responders. There are many, many roles within an organisation that's that big. And I was told that when I started, there were 620 different roles could be performed within the organisation. I'll come back to that again in a moment too. So I began as senior chaplain with Victoria Police in 1995. There was a chaplaincy service prior to that. It was provided by ITIM, the Interchurch Trade and Industry Mission. And that contract, for whatever reason, was terminated, and I don't know the reasons for that. The ITIM model was to go to, for example, a town. They'd visit the butter factory, the post office, the police station, do the rounds, and then that was a valued ministry, but for whatever reason it was not seen as satisfactory. And that would have been the opportunity for the Victoria Police to say, we don't need chaplains. And I understand, and we've got Ray Shuey listening in on this, but I understand, Ray, well, no, you don't have to answer this. There was there was some pressure from certain places within the force to say we really don't need chaplains because we've got psychologists, we've got social workers, we've got welfare workers, and why would you need chaplains? And it was Neil Comrie, who Ray knows well, who said, no, we need chaplains as well. We need that spiritual dimension to be cared for, and so as a result, I was amongst many that were interviewed for that position of senior chaplain, full time with the force as an employee of the Victoria Police. I didn't recognise it at the time, but I was extremely fortunate in that, being the first person actually employed in the role of chaplain, there was actually no model to follow, and I had no predecessor, and therefore there were no corporate expectations, so to speak. Or put another way, nobody knew what I was supposed to be doing, and neither did I. And so we sort of we worked together to develop the ministry. The job description was actually pretty succinct. It said to provide pastoral care and spiritual support to police members and their families, and to perform ceremonial duties as required. So that's all I had to do. And that was in a force of 14,000 people. What they failed to tell me was, of course, that it was spread across the whole of Victoria, and but there was some promise of some funding for a network to be put in place. But the way that was described in my original job description, and I believe it runs to many pages now in the way the chaplain's position is described, it really sums up the role of chaplaincy in emergency services, to provide pastoral care and spiritual support, and to provide ceremonies, for example, funerals, of course, as well, as required. I might just add at that point in that I was also part of many celebrations. So I conducted many weddings for police members, which were a great privilege, and also baptisms, and then the funerals of many members. In an organisation that size, you have people who die for all sorts of reasons, just due to health reasons and other accidents and etc. So there is also a role of conducting funerals, which actually surprised me, that the degree to which that was part of the role just amongst the normal staff. I was given great freedom and remarkable freedom, I would say, during what was that learning curve that I mentioned earlier. And very early in the piece, I realised that many police members had their own ideas of what the role of a chaplain was, and what they might be subjected to if ever they were caught by a chaplain. And so we had to try to disabuse them of some of those ideas. In policing language, I think it was all about motive and intent. Frankly, they saw the chaplain as a Bible basher. The motive was to possibly ram the Bible down their throat and to evangelise. And that actually I saw as a fundamental problem in the way that I and then others later on were going to perceive the chaplaincy service. And I heard several stories of the rapid evacuation of police stations when chaplains or local clergy pulled up outside. And so I had to, I had this early realisation that I needed to turn that around somehow. So the role at that stage was to demonstrate by our actions that we were not there to evangelise or to promote our religious views as such. And there's another delicate path to walk in all of that because, well, that's not my style anyway, and we're talking about 1995, 96 here. But I had to realise that the matter of the separation between church and state was a potential issue if people really wanted to push that. And the ITIM chaplains were on contract. I was actually an employee of the state and of the police force, and there was the potential for some people to say this is not on. You know, you don't have church people, religious people employed doing this role as an employee of the force. However, it was never raised seriously, but it was raised obscurely, obliquely. And then there was this budget item. I'd been told at the outset that I would have a budget to help establish 32 positions across the state. The budget turned out to be $60 a week to cover petrol money for each person. So it was a voluntary service, obviously, and my job was to coordinate that. I saw the establishment of that inter-church network as my primary task, and so I travelled many hundreds of kilometres over that period. It was a period of about 7 months, and eventually filled all of those positions with men and women who, in my opinion, understood what non-judgmental pastoral care was. And so a big part of my role then was to support them and to make sure they were handling what they were doing in their own areas around the state. And a major part was to arrange a 3-day conference at the Academy each year where they could familiarise themselves and orientate themselves to the work of policing. And I received wonderful support from the force in arranging those workplace visits and speakers on various roles and organising the conference. As I mentioned earlier, I was told there were over 620 different roles, so it wasn't hard to find a topic to make up a conference in those days. And that includes unsworn members too. We must remember that there are a lot of members of Victoria Police who are unsworn members. They're not in uniform, they're not detectives or uniformed police, but they do a wonderful job in other areas. And it's not just administration. There are lots of very significant roles played by those who are not sworn members. I soon realised that a fundamental part of my role was to be informed about their role. The truth of the matter is that the police or any person is not going to share their personal or workplace issues with you if they perceive that your agenda is more important than theirs. And so I used to ask when I met with anybody or went into to discuss issues with a person, what do you do? That became my first question. What did you do before that also became a significant question, because people move from job to job. They might have been in a station 1 minute and in a different setting the next. And then, of course, how long have you been doing it? And those questions were really related to me wanting to know about the stress levels they've been under, and particularly with PTSD, those stress levels can build up over a period of time. It's not necessarily one confronting incident that creates those situations, but a build-up of going to many things, sometimes over many years, that creates those problems. So what do you do? How long have you been doing it? Were important questions for me. And I'll give a little example of that. Supporting a new constable at a local station who has just been to his first suicide. And this is something that happens in our city much more than we appreciate, I think. But that is a very different thing to supporting a seasoned homicide detective who's dealing with other issues after, say, 15 or 20 years in the job. So listening and being seen to listen and trying to understand was a basic part of turning around the perception of what a chaplain was on about and what the whole network was on about, not just me, but what we as chaplains might be able to do for people and how we might support them when we met with them. How am I going for time? I just want to make sure I'm not running over. No. However, the profile of chaplaincy was still really non-existent across the organisation as a whole. And promoting the availability of chaplains worked fairly well in the country areas. You can understand how that works in a country town or in a fairly large country town, regional area. But promoting the availability of chaplains in the city, in the metro area, was an entirely different thing. It was not possible for me and one or two other people to give chaplaincy a profile across the whole of Melbourne. All of that changed, sadly and rather dramatically, in tragic circumstances when Sergeant Gary Silk and Senior Constable Rod Miller were murdered in Moorabbin in August 1998. Without going into detail, I was called very soon after the shootings, and I had an informal role at the Monash Hospital soon after that, where a large number of Rod's colleagues had gathered, and Rod's wife Carmel. And the role, well, you walk into the middle of those things and you say, you know, what can I do? I don't have anything I'm going to necessarily plant on you. I haven't got a template of how this works. All you can do is just be with people. And over the years, I found that that was extremely valuable in its own right. But provide comfort, give support as best you can. And then it was my responsibility after that, in the following week or so, to conduct 2 police honours funerals that were to be held on consecutive days at the Police Academy Chapel in Glen Waverley. So there's the ceremonial role really coming out very, very clearly. And I say coming out clearly because this is police honours held in the wake of members who died in the line of duty. And that's where the symbolism and the way the organisation expresses its grief and its respect for members, that's where it all really comes together. Now, all of that is a story in its own right, but briefly stated, there were approximately 4,500 people at each service. The nature of the services seemed to be well accepted by the majority, and in this time of shock and sadness, chaplaincy was seen to have a role. And it was a stressful time for everybody, a sad time, but it was, I think that was the place where chaplaincy got the organisational profile. And it was sad that it had to happen in that way, but in a way that's where the chaplain was going to give the lead to the grief that was being experienced. My very distinct discovery and memory from that time was that organisations grieve like individuals do. And my role was to attempt to address that, as it is for any chaplain, SES, with the ambulance chaplains and so on. That's the role, to look after the organisation as well as looking after individuals. So the organisation does funny things at times like that. They can look after or consider that the needs of the organisation come before the needs of the family. And I don't say that as a criticism, it's a reaction, not something that is organised or initiated by any individual. And there can be anger in the workplace. And that can be for all sorts of reasons, which we won't go into here. But sometimes the families become scared because they think that could have been my husband, that could have been my wife or daughter in that situation. And in instances where the offenders are still at large, you're dealing with that one too. So in a way, part of my role was to protect the immediate family from organisational overreach. And that overreach occurs because everybody is trying to be kind. They're all wanting to know, to convey their sympathy. We get swamped with suggestions which are based on kindness. And you can have colleagues doing that, you can have the public doing that, you can have the media doing that, and you can have the politicians doing that. And so there's a potential for the family to be absolutely overwhelmed by what's going on around them. So the role of the chaplain in that sense and that setting, I think it sounds a bit grandiose, but I think you're there to be a protector and you're there to be a moderator. And there was one situation around some of that where I told a superintendent to back off and thought, there goes my job. And but he looked at me and grinned and he said, I know exactly what you mean. And he arranged for certain things not to happen, which were about to happen. So that's another obscure but a different facet of chaplaincy to protect people. Although the police honours aspects of the ceremonies are in theory a separate component, it's important that the chapel services recognise the tragedies that occurred in the line of duty, as I say, and controlling the dignity of the service and the length of those ceremonies was, as I saw it, a part of my role. I just want to very quickly, because I know I've only got 5 minutes or so left, but I just want to move on to other things. Today that chaplaincy team consists of over 60 chaplains across Victoria. There are currently 2, but hopefully soon 3 senior chaplains full-time. And the network consists of Christian, Muslim, Sikh, Jewish and Aboriginal representation, Aboriginal spirituality represented in that chaplaincy group. And it's very much interfaith. It is not interchurch in that strict sense now, and religious diversity is recognised and it's respected. And I'm not sure what happens if I hold a book like that up to the screen, but that's not going to focus, no. This is a book which I had a little bit to do with the original edition of writing about the Christian church, a practical reference to religious and spiritual diversity for operational police, put out by the Australian and New Zealand Policing Advisory Agency, as ANSPAR. And if you open it, you have tabs which show the police what they might need to know about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander spirituality, Baha'i, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Maori spirituality, and Sikhism. And so a police officer, if they wish to educate themselves a little, can find something about those particular faiths if they should find that they're dealing with an issue which it would help them if they had a bit of education around that particular faith background. And the quick examples of those situations that I might give are that a homicide detective goes to a Muslim murder scene. That it would help them enormously in being respected themselves and conducting themselves professionally if they know that in due course, when it's appropriate, that they close the person's eyes, that they orientate that person's face towards Mecca, and then they cover them with a white sheet. Now, if you do things like that, it does engender respect for the police force, but it also has a tremendous comforting effect at the scene of something that's quite terrible and traumatic, especially if family members are around that scene or members of the same faith. And knowing who to call in those circumstances it can also be very helpful. I had one instance myself where a child was run over in the western suburbs by a truck outside the home, riding a bike on the road, and that little child was a Muslim child of a Muslim family. And it was early in the piece for me. I just got a call on the car radio to say, would you get there to this address, please? We need some advice about what to do. And when I got there, I spoke to the parents who were distraught, but they told me the name. Unfortunately, I knew the imam in Preston, and I rang him and said, what do I do here? I don't know how to help these people. And he said, there are things that need to be done, which I can do. And we arranged for the little boys, for the imam to meet the little boy's body as he was taken into the coroner's court in South Melbourne into coronial services. And the various rituals were performed in the back of the coroner's vehicle, funeral director's vehicle at the coroner's court in the driveway. So little things like that meant so much to the family. I say it's a little thing, but you know, we need to try to teach the police themselves. Ask questions. Don't just go in there and do things. Ask the family, what is it that you require? And they'll tell you. And that applies to all faiths, I guess. But it was a learning for me too, of course, in that situation. I don't really need to explain pastoral care to you. I think that's understood and practical. But the religious education aspect of this role that I had, that was very important, and that we needed to proactively start to educate our chaplains about the needs of other faiths. What you've got is a police force that back in 1995 is basically Christian, or nothing at all, as you'll appreciate, but then we're starting to get Sikhs and Muslims and Jews and so on coming in as police members. And now we've got that mix of multi-faith chaplaincy interconnecting with a multi-faith police force. And I think that's it's very gratifying to see that is working well, and that it's supported and encouraged by Victoria Police themselves. There was just one quick instance that I'll mention of a Sikh person having his turban pulled off in Swanson Street in the city some years ago. That was such a serious thing for that person that he tried to suicide. We need to let the police members know that you don't take a Sikh person's turban off if they are in public. To be seen in public without your turban is just totally humiliating, to the point of that person wanting to take their own life. They're the spiritual, religious crossovers that occur within the policing world. They apply, as I say, to right across the emergency services as we seek to respect and to understand each other more. Have I got time for one more little instance, Jeffrey, please? Just, I just wanted to mention, to make the point that on the 29th of January in 2009, little Darcy Freeman was thrown from the Westgate Bridge by her father, and she died that afternoon in the Royal Children's Hospital. And later that day, I tried to support several water police members who were the ones who lifted Darcy out of the water. My comment of one of them to me was, "Well, where was your God that day, chaplain?" And or where was your God today? Was I was asking the same question, and I think sometimes all you can do is sit in bewilderment with people and say, "That's my role." I don't want to tell you that I know all the answers. I want to share your bewilderment with you, and I think that's an appropriate thing to do. If you come across as you've got certainty when other people have no certainty, you're not reaching them and you're not ministering to them. So I identified that as spiritual trauma, and as so many of the other things are that I've mentioned tonight. I think that the chaplain's role across all those emergency services is to address the loss of meaning which can occur as a result of their work. We all take our inner life to work, no matter what we do. If you take your inner life to work, when that includes your values or your beliefs or your ethics or your morals or whatever it is that you take to work, and then the nature of that work starts destroying what you've held on to maybe all your life, and in which you place faith or trust or security or all of those things that go on inside us, then you might even have a homespun spirituality or firm religious beliefs. But in my opinion, it's the difference between the long-held beliefs that you have and what you actually encounter in real life that can destroy you and be the start of PTSD or the beginnings of depression or of throwing the job in or whatever it is that is the result of that. So I label that spiritual trauma, and I think the role of the chaplain in emergency services is really to try to get under that spiritual trauma layer and to see it and to say outwardly, openly, spiritual health is related to mental health. And if we don't look after spiritual health, then we're ignoring a basic part of how people function. Lots of other things I could say perhaps, but maybe I should stop there, Jeffrey, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Jim. That's covered a lot of ground, and it's I'm sure will raise a lot of discussion points. But Jim, as people start to think about that, let me go back to the time that you spent overseas on study. Were there things that you found that were unique to Australia, or is the situation here the same as what you found in other places?
No, it was very different in different places. And in fact, in some ways, when I raised the question in groups in, say, in Canada or in the United States in particular, people would say, "That's interesting, we never thought about that." Like they had chaplaincy services, but the idea of spiritual trauma was not a language that they seemed to be comfortable to use. And so we had some very interesting discussions around that. Separation between church and state in the United States is very clear. So they were people who were from various churches and were contracted or paid to provide a service to a police force in a particular town or state. But it was pretty religious, I have to say. It was about largely about evangelising, if possible. and I don't know whether that's changed a lot. Canada was pretty much on the same wavelength as we are, and in places like and England, of course, Germany and Holland, they all have great chaplaincy services, but dealing with the secular understanding of the police forces themselves. Where in Germany, a bus load of us went to a cathedral in Berlin, a bus load of recruits, and I went with them on the chaplaincy visit. And the idea of the chaplain there, the senior chaplain, took them to the Lutheran cathedral, and then to a synagogue, and then to the Greek Orthodox Church. But when we got into the cathedral, there were 30 police recruits with us, and the chaplain standing in front of them in the pew said, "Would you put your hand up if you've never been in a church?" And the whole lot put their hand up. So it was introducing people not to religion as such, but just to the concept of worship space and what to do if you're called to go into a church or into a chapel or into a nursing home where there's a chapel, into a church where there's a reserved sacrament. How do you conduct yourself in a mosque? And the rabbi, the senior chaplain in New York, was a rabbi, and he took me to his synagogue, and then the second in charge is an imam, and he took me to Friday prayers in New York in the mosque. It was just in New York. There was that interfaith aspect, but they were all looking after their own faiths, and they didn't hear, you know, in Caulfield, for example, in Melbourne, the rabbi goes and visits the Caulfield police station on a weekly basis as the chaplain to that area. And the Greek Orthodox priest looks after the South Melbourne police station. And the imams likewise move about Werribee and so on. So that's wonderful. Here we've got that movement and acceptance of another faith walking into the police station. But over there it was really quite segregated, although it existed in terms of the fact that there were people of different faiths, but they didn't seem to interact with each other. That may have changed. And in London, there was there are actually separate police associations, like we have our police association here in Victoria. There's a Black Police Association and a Sikh Police Association, and etc. So I got to go to some nice dinners with them. But again, this issue of how you interact comfortably with one another can be very different. So I like to think that in some ways we set them thinking about some new ways of doing things, looking at the way our police chaplaincy network worked here in Victoria. I think chaplains should attend at the scenes of incidents, and I did a fair bit of that myself. The Burnley Tunnel fire, the Monash University shootings, things like that I attended as senior chaplain. That's a point where you can be on scene with the police members, and you can relieve the police members of the stress of having to deal with members of the public too. So what I've been pushing for lately, and I'm hoping it'll get up again in the coming state election, but before the last state election, we were promised nearly 5 million to establish a pilot program for 3 years for police chaplains to attend at scenes with trauma workers, psychologists, social workers and others who can be a quick response team and get in there quickly to look after people and to identify them quickly, and then say, this is where you can get help. Because, you know, after the Gargasulis incident, for example, there were over 1,000 people sought formal help for what they saw in Burke Street. But many hundreds more got on trains, trams, went back to the office, and then weeks, months down the track said, I don't think I'm travelling so well. And there's a way of having a quick response, including chaplaincy in that, because what I was saying before about spiritual trauma, that happens to the public too when they see something like that. You drive past a fatal car accident, or you see other confronting things. That can affect you as an individual in the community. So that's something I've been pushing. When the current government got in, they said, we don't think you need that, so we lost the grant. And so I'm hoping we can push that one again coming up to the next state election and see if that can be created, because I spoke to the Upper House inquiry or investigation into the workings of the justice system in Victoria last year. And I think one of the recommendations that's come out of what I was putting to them about this type of concept, it might have it might get a voice in the recommendations that are made. So I still keep pushing on those sorts of things. I go back to saying I think that we need to understand that spiritual health is a part of mental health. And it's one of the principles that I try to work out of in my ministry.
Thanks. Daniel, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah. Do you play much of a role with offenders themselves, like caring for their spiritual needs?
Yes. Quite. Well, if they finish up in prison, then there's prison chaplaincy, and that's a totally separate field. And you might remember names such as Father Brosnan and so on, who established very, very significant chaplaincies at places like Pentridge. There is a prison chaplaincy service, and it does a wonderful work, but there needs to be a separation between police chaplains and prison chaplains for obvious reasons. I wouldn't be received very well if I went into a prison and tried prison chaplaincy, as I say, for obvious reasons. So we do keep those very separate. We actually had a person once who was a prison chaplain in country Victoria, and put his hand up and said, I'd like to be a police chaplain as well because I've got a day spare. And I said to him, I don't think that's a very good idea. And he couldn't quite get why at that stage, but no, we keep the two fields separate. The caring for offenders is an important thing. Yes, I'm sorry, I lost you on the screen. The caring for offenders, Daniel, is a very important thing. And you can understand that in a wide range of circumstances, some of those people are indeed suicidal and need to be looked after, to be locked away when they didn't expect that. And especially, I have to say, when some of their trials are taking so long to come before the courts with the backlog, that's a real issue. So chaplaincy does a wonderful work in that field.
Thank you.
And Ray, would you like to ask a question?
Thanks very much. Firstly, I'd like to compliment you on excellent career service to both Victoria Police and the community of Victoria, and especially for your empathy and understanding. You omitted to say, however, that it's not a 9-to-5 job that you were doing, it's a 24/7. And quite often we met in traumatic circumstances after hours. So the question I'd like to pose, and you mentioned it briefly, is the fact that we tend to think of those involved in critical incidents, and we hit those as those we believe is critical risk. And quite frequently we find it's those on the peripheral, as you mentioned in a couple of examples, that really suffer the heavy PTSD, and they're the ones that organisations, I don't think, realise that that may be the second level of tier that needs to be addressed as something that should be automatically introduced at the scene, not sort of 2 weeks later or something like that. So yes. I appreciate your view on that sort of secondary aspect. Yeah.
in the it's interesting you raised that, because in the hearing before with the Justice Inquiry last September-ish, roughly that was, I used the term secondary victims, and some people on the panel said they'd never heard that before, and I said, well, you know, and just recently they'd had a fire near the Women's Hospital in which people were incinerated in their cars, just near the Women's Hospital there on the corner. People came out of offices and were standing around watching all of that happen. I don't want to distress anybody, but you know that there are sounds and there are all sorts of other things that go on around that, but they watch and then they go off. They're onlookers. Looking after onlookers is a very serious issue in our community. I think we need to think about it. But all sorts of other stuff happens day by day where people see things which they never thought they would ever see in their lives. And, you know, a woman jumped out of a building in Burke Street about 18 months ago holding a baby and landed on the footpath in front of all the pedestrians. Who looks after those people? We don't have a system to look after people like that. We ought to have, and they ought to know that there is a system. You know, there are services provided by the government, but you've got to be on site, and I think you've got to be there with people close to the scene, and they've got to trust you that you know what you're doing, and you're going to be there for them down the track. You could look at it one way and say it's financially good for the government if they prevent those sorts of things from finishing up in the health system or the hospital system. But I hope that's what you were really alluding to, Ray.
Right. My question is a personal experience, Reverend Jim, that I managed a company where I had an industrial accident and a death by an engineer died in investigating an inefficiency of a particular mechanism where he tripped a hydraulic and brought the mechanism down on himself, unfortunately. And as the manager, I felt obliged to go and advise the widow or the deceased wife. And when the police came to, in the initial phase, to inspect the accident, because we did call them, I said to them, well, the assistant manager and myself will go and advise the deceased wife. And the constable at the time said, oh no, sir, you don't have that responsibility. We will advise the deceased wife.
Yes.
So so we all went in the end, the three of us, and we shared the trauma of having to advise the wife. But what I wanted to know is, do the police at constable level, where they have to do this task, get specific training to help them to face it and also to conduct the advice of the death?
Well, two parts to that. One is what you see when you go to the scene, as you say. I used to take the recruits, we used to go in buses down to the coroner's court, as we call it, but and they'd observe a post-mortem. So every squad going through back in those days observed a post-mortem.
Right.
Today, I understand they have a video presentation, and you sit in a classroom at the academy and watch the same thing happening. It's not the same. It's just not the same. And I think that really, if the first time you discover that you can't cope with seeing something like that is when you're standing on the edge, like in a factory where there's been an industrial accident, or when you're standing on the edge of the Hume Highway with semi-trailers whizzing past you, you don't really want to find that you can't cope at that point, and for a whole range of other reasons too. So that was one thing that we used to do to prepare them. They're prepared differently that way now. The other part of that question is, I used to do the lectures in death notification for all the squads.
Right.
So I'd take them for a class about what are the issues, how you inform yourself, what's likely to happen by way of reaction to the person when you give them that news, how to look after them if they should collapse. These days we're very thing about not touching or hugging anybody, but I've actually seen a police officer deliver a death notification when I was present with him, and he stood with his hands rigidly by his side when the poor mother was actually hanging around his neck, wanting him to just hold her.
Yeah.
So, you know, I've always said to the recruits, it's okay to be physical at that point. You know, how could you not hold someone when you've just told them that their son's been killed? But so I think I understand they still do death notification lectures, but they're done not by chaplains now, but by the instructors at the academy.
Trainers. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those questions to everyone who's participated. It's been, again, interesting to see the range of thoughts that your address, Jim, has created and the questions that have been asked. Terry, back to you, but I'm wondering whether you'd be happy to express our thanks to Jim, please.
Well, thanks very much, Chairman Jeff, and to Reverend Jim. It is a pleasure to express a vote of thanks to this evening as our guest speaker on our webinar. And we've appreciated really hearing of a very interesting and challenging lifetime and vocation in the chaplaincy of support, particularly with the police. You've had to move from chaplain and your ministry to the faithful to the workplace where multi-faiths and even non-faiths exist and deal with the traumas that workplaces bring to life. And so we're dealing with people that not only face traumas, but have lost loved ones. And in particular, we'd like to express our appreciation for your past service to the police force of Victoria that look after us, our safety in the community, because we need the police members to be capable of managing the traumas that they face, the suicides, the murders, the accidents, the missing people, family violence. All these trauma areas do have an impact on the human being in dealing with them. And so you've brought us a lot closer to understanding this work of the chaplaincy in dealing with this trauma that and experiences that our police force members have. So on behalf of the Eastern Suburbs Regional Group of our Order of Australia Association and the members who participated this evening, we'd like to thank you most sincerely for the address that you've given us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. My privilege. Thank you.
With that, I believe we come to the end of our session. So thank you again to everyone who's participated. Particular thanks, Jim, and all the best, everyone.